Q. When and where was Alexander Pope born? Ans. Alexander Pope was born in London in the year 1688. Q. What disease affected Alexander Pope? Ans. Alexander Pope was affected by tuberculosis of the bone. Q. Who is considered the second most quoted writer in the English language after Shakespeare? Ans. Alexander Pope is considered the second most quoted writer in the English language after Shakespeare. Q. Who famously said about Alexander Pope, "If Pope be not a poet, where is true poetry to be found?" Ans. Dr. Johnson famously said, "If Pope be not a poet, where is true poetry to be found?" Q. Which literary work was written by Alexander Pope? Ans. Alexander Pope wrote, Windsor Forest. Q. What greatly impressed Alexander Pope since he was a child? Ans. Since he was a child, Alexander Pope was greatly impressed by Homer. Q. Did Alexander Pope co-author any Restoration comedy? If yes, which one? Ans. Yes, Alexander Pope co-authored the Restoration comedy, 3 Hours After Marriage. Q. How did being a Roman Catholic affect Alexander Pope? Ans. Being a Roman Catholic affected Alexander Pope in that he could not receive a good education due to the prevailing anti-Catholic sentiment of the time. Q. Who is attributed with writing The Imitation of Horace? The author of The Imitation of Horace is Alexander Pope. Q. Which writer is known for the mock epic, The Rape of the Lock? Alexander Pope is the author of the mock epic poem, The Rape of the Lock. Q. Who originally coined the phrase, damn with faint praise? The phrase, damn with faint praise, is attributed to Alexander Pope. Q. Which books did Alexander Pope translate into English? Alexander Pope translated the epic poems, Iliad, and Odyssey, by Homer. This translation project spanned a period of 11 years. Q. In the poetry of the age of Pope, what was considered more important? In the poetry of the age of Pope, the emphasis was primarily on form. Q. During the age of Pope, what form became the predominant style for serious verse? In the age of Pope, the closed couplet became the prevailing form for serious poetic works. Q. What title is often given to Alexander Pope? Alexander Pope is often referred to as the Prince of Classicism. Q. Who bestowed the title Prince of Classicism upon Alexander Pope? Professor Eton is credited with bestowing the title Prince of Classicism upon Alexander Pope. Q. In The Rape of the Lock, which characters represent the aristocracy of the 18th century? The characters Belinda and Baron in The Rape of the Lock represent the aristocracy of the 18th century. Q. Who authored the poem Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot? Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot was written by Alexander Pope. Q. Where did Alexander Pope pass away? Alexander Pope died in Twickenham, England. Q. According to Alexander Pope, who are the ones who rush in where angels fear to tread? According to Alexander Pope, fools are the ones who rush in where angels fear to tread. Q. Which woman was Alexander Pope strongly attached to? Alexander Pope was strongly attached to Lady M. Montagu. Q. Which club was Alexander Pope a member of? Alexander Pope was a member of the Scriblerus Club. Q. When did Alexander Pope first publish his mock epic The Rape of the Lock, and how many cantos did it have? Alexander Pope first published his mock epic The Rape of the Lock in 1712. It consisted of 2 cantos. Q. Who wrote the poem Eloisa to Abelard? Alexander Pope wrote the poem Eloisa to Abelard. Q. Which poem by Alexander Pope was inspired by a man who eloped with his pregnant pupil and was later castrated at the command of her uncle? The poem inspired by this incident is Eloisa to Abelard, written by Alexander Pope. Q. What is another name for the age of Pope? The age of Pope is also known as the Augustan age. Q. Addison and Jonathan Swift, famous prose writers, were contemporaries of whom? Famous prose writers like Addison and Jonathan Swift were contemporaries of Alexander Pope. Q. Which satirical poem by Alexander Pope was inspired by an incident involving Lord Petre and Miss Arabella Fermor? The satirical poem inspired by this incident is The Rape of the Lock, written by Alexander Pope. Q. What was the main focus of the poets during the age of Pope? The subject matter of the poets during the age of Pope revolved around town life and cultural society. Q. How did Matthew Arnold describe Dryden and Pope? Matthew Arnold referred to Dryden and Pope as the classics of our prose. Q. Who is the author of the poem, Brutus? The poem, Brutus, was written by Alexander Pope. Q. Which of Alexander Pope's poems was left unfinished? The poem that Alexander Pope left unfinished is Brutus. Q. What is the basis of the narrative in The Rape of the Lock, by Alexander Pope? The Rape of the Lock, by Alexander Pope is based on a real-life incident. Q. Besides being a poet, what other conditions did Alexander Pope suffer from? Alexander Pope suffered from spinal deformity and asthma in addition to being a poet. Q. Whose work did Alexander Pope assist in publishing as a member of the Scriblerus Club? Alexander Pope helped Jonathan Swift in the publication of Gulliver's Travels, as a member of the Scriblerus Club. Q. Who is the author of An Essay on Man? An Essay on Man was written by Alexander Pope. Q. What genre does An Essay on Man, by Alexander Pope belong to? An Essay on Man, by Alexander Pope is actually a poem. Q. In The Rape of the Lock, who or what is referred to as Shock? In The Rape of the Lock, Shock is the name of a dog. Q. What are the three main periods into which Alexander Pope's literary life usually falls? Alexander Pope's literary life is typically divided into three main periods. Q. Who is credited with saying, "No writer reflects so clearly and completely the spirit of his own days as Pope does." The statement, "No writer reflects so clearly and completely the spirit of his own days as Pope does," is attributed to Leslie Stephen. Q. What genre of poetry dominated during the age of Pope? Satiric poetry was the dominant genre during the age of Pope. Q. What physical characteristics did Alexander Pope possess, and how tall was he? Alexander Pope had a hunchback and stood at a height of 4 feet and 6 inches. Q. In The Rape of the Lock, what does Belinda's hair transform into at the end? Towards the end of The Rape of the Lock, Belinda's hair is depicted as transforming into a group of stars. Q. Who is the author of the Pastorals? The Pastorals were written by Alexander Pope. Q. What was the first work that Alexander Pope wrote? The first work penned by Alexander Pope was the Pastorals. Q. How many pastorals are there in total by Alexander Pope? The Pastorals by Alexander Pope consist of 4 poems, Spring, Summer, Autumn, and Winter. Q. Did Alexander Pope have any siblings? No, Alexander Pope did not have any siblings. Q. Did Alexander Pope ever marry? No, Alexander Pope never married. Q. Who made a request to Alexander Pope to write The Rape of the Lock? Alexander Pope was requested by his friend John Carroll to write The Rape of the Lock. Q. Where was Alexander Pope buried? A. Alexander Pope was buried in St. Mary's Church. Q. Which school did Alexander Pope attend as his alma mater? A. Alexander Pope attended Twyford School as his alma mater. Q. Who authored the Dunciad? A. The Dunciad was authored by Alexander Pope. Q. When Alexander Pope's edition of Shakespeare faced heavy criticism, how did he respond to ridicule the critics and writers? A. Alexander Pope responded to the criticism with a burlesque titled The Dunciad, in which he ridiculed the critics and writers. Q. Who was the dispute between Miss Arabella and Lord Peter that The Rape of the Lock aimed to resolve? A. The Rape of the Lock was written to end a dispute between Miss Arabella and Lord Peter. Q. What was the nickname of Alexander Pope? A. Alexander Pope was known by the nickname, the Wasp of Twickenham, due to his sharp and critical literary satires directed at his fellow writers. Q. What were the professions of Alexander Pope? A. Alexander Pope was a poet, translator, and prose writer. Q. Who authored the early career of Alexander Pope? A. The early career of Alexander Pope was authored by George Sherburne. Q. At what age did Alexander Pope pass away? A. Alexander Pope died at the age of 56. Q. What is the nature of satire in Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock? A. The Rape of the Lock is a type of satire known as impersonal satire. Q. What type of satire is present in Alexander Pope's Dunciad? A. Dunciad, by Alexander Pope, is an example of personal satire. Q. In what way is Alexander Pope's Dunciad related to Virgil's Aeneid? A. Alexander Pope's Dunciad can be considered a comic rendition or parody of Virgil's Aeneid. Q. Who is attributed to the quote, "A little learning is a dangerous thing"? A. The famous quote, "A little learning is a dangerous thing," is associated with Alexander Pope. Q. At what age did Alexander Pope develop tuberculosis of the spine? A. Alexander Pope contracted tuberculosis of the spine when he was only 12 years old. Q. Which Restoration dramatists were among Alexander Pope's early literary mentors, besides William Wycherley? A. Alongside William Wycherley, William Congreve was one of the Restoration dramatists who mentored Alexander Pope in his early literary pursuits. Q. What epic poem does The Rape of the Lock satirize or parody? A. The Rape of the Lock is a parody of Homer's epic poem, the Iliad. Q. Who is the author of An Essay on Criticism? A. An Essay on Criticism was written by Alexander Pope. Q. Which individual fiercely criticized Alexander Pope's Essay on Criticism? A. Essay on Criticism, by Alexander Pope faced fierce criticism from John Dennis. Q. What is Alexander Pope often regarded as a master of? A. Alexander Pope is widely regarded as a master of the heroic couplet. Q. Who was Alexander Pope's father and what was his occupation? A. Alexander Pope's father was a linen merchant. Q. When was the second edition of The Rape of the Lock published, and how many cantos did it have? A. The second edition of The Rape of the Lock was published in 1714, and it consisted of 5 cantos. Q. What was the name of Alexander Pope's father? A. Alexander Pope's father was also named Alexander Pope. Q. At what age did Alexander Pope publish his Essay on Criticism? A. Alexander Pope published his Essay on Criticism at the age of 23. Q. In which work did Alexander Pope aim to vindicate the ways of God to man? A. Alexander Pope aimed to vindicate the ways of God to man, in his work titled An Essay on Criticism. Q. Who is attributed to the quote, to err is human, to forgive divine. Alexander Pope is credited with the quote, to err is human, to forgive divine. Q. What is the term used to describe the supernatural element employed by Alexander Pope in The Rape of the Lock? The supernatural element used by Alexander Pope in The Rape of the Lock is known as machinery or supernatural machinery. Q. According to Alexander Pope, where does hope spring eternal? According to Alexander Pope, hope springs eternal in the human breast. Q. Which century is commonly referred to as the age of prose and reason? The 18th century is often referred to as the age of prose and reason. Q. Who wrote the poem Elegy to the Memory of an Unfortunate Lady? Alexander Pope wrote the poem Elegy to the Memory of an Unfortunate Lady. Q. Who is attributed with the quote, nature is order and rule and harmony in the visible world? The quote, nature is order and rule and harmony in the visible world, is attributed to Alexander Pope. Q. In which literary forms did Alexander Pope excel? Alexander Pope was known for his mastery in the literary forms of epigram and satire. Q. Who defended the ancient writers by expressing the idea, those rules of old discovered, not devised, are nature still, but nature methodized. It was Alexander Pope who supported the ancient writers by articulating the notion that, those rules of old discovered, not devised, are nature still, but nature methodized. Q. In the poem, The Rape of the Lock, who provides the Baron with a pair of scissors? In The Rape of the Lock, the character Clarissa provides the Baron with a pair of scissors. Q. What genre can be attributed to Alexander Pope's poem, An Essay on Man? An Essay on Man, by Alexander Pope is categorized as a philosophical poem. Q. Who is known for the quote, the proper study of mankind is man? The quote, the proper study of mankind is man, is commonly associated with Alexander Pope.